This is not the Potala Palace in Tibet. This is Putuo Zongsheng Temple in Chengde, China, better known as the Little Potala Palace. Chengde, just beyond Beijing, was the Qing Dynasty's second political center and the empire's third great center of Tibetan Buddhism, after Lhasa and Beijing. In 1793, Lord Macartney arrived in China on behalf of King George III to congratulate the Qianlong Emperor on his birthday. He spent a full 14 hours inside this magnificent complex and marveled that its decoration surpassed even St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So, what secrets are hidden behind this extraordinary palace temple? The Qing Empire was the most successful imperial dynasty in China between the 17th and the 19th centuries. It brought the Manchus, Han Chinese, Mongols, Tibetans, and Hui Muslims under the authority of a single monarch, to allow Mongol princes who followed Tibetan Buddhism to make a pilgrimage without traveling all the way to Beijing. The Qing court built 12 Tibetan Buddhist temples in Chengde. The largest and most magnificent of them was the Putuo Zongsheng Temple, better known as the Little Potala Palace. In both scale and design, it was built as a close echo of the Potala Palace in Tibet. Putuo Zongsheng means the sacred site of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. The Potala Palace in Tibet carries essentially the same meaning. It was the residence of the Dalai Lama, who in Tibetan Buddhism is revered as an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. This is exactly why, during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor, construction began in 1767 on Putuo Zongsheng Temple. It was intended to serve as a residence for the Dalai Lama, yet from its completion in 1771 down to the present day, the Dalai Lama has never spent a single day here. The main gate of Putuo Zongsheng Temple brings together Manchu, Han Chinese, Tibetan, and Mongolian elements in a single architectural composition. The plaque above it bears the temple's name in 4 scripts: Tibetan, Manchu, Chinese, and Mongolian, all written by the Qianlong Emperor. Along the walls, you can see enclosed Tibetan-style land windows. These are purely decorative, but they originated on the Tibetan Plateau, where such designs helped combine visual beauty with protection against cold winds and harsh weather. Behind the main gate stands a massive steel pavilion. This one also served as a commemorative purpose. In its outward form, it closely resembles the Shengde Shengong steel pavilions found in Qing Imperial mausoleums. Structures that, in the vocabulary of royal architecture, carries a highly exalted and ceremonial significance. On either side of the pavilion entrance are carved Buddhist wheels of Dharma, symbolizing the endless spread of the Buddha's teachings, rolling forward like a turning wheel. Inside the pavilion stand 3 enormous stone steles. Their inscriptions mainly record the story of the Torghut Mongols' return to China and the favorable treatment they received from the Qing court. In the mid-17th century, the Torghut Mongols had originally grazed and migrated across what is now Xinjiang in northwestern China. But because of war and upheaval, they moved westward to the Volga region of present-day Russia. where they later suffered heavily under the rule of Tsarist Russia. By the mid-18th century, having heard of the growing power of the Qing Empire, the Torghuters decided to return to China under the leadership of Wu Baxi. In 1771, Torghut leader Wu Baxi arrived in Chengde at precisely the moment when Putuo Zongsheng Temple had just been completed. Qianlong personally invited him to visit this newly finished temple. To commemorate the great event, the emperor ordered the construction of this grand Stele Pavilion. Along the central axis, the next structure that comes into view is the Tibetan Buddhist Five Pagoda Gate. As its name suggests, this gateway is crowned by 5 pagodas. From west to east, they are red, green, yellow, white, and black. These 5 colors correspond to the 5 elements: fire, earth, water, wind, and space. They have also been interpreted as representing the 5 major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The yellow pagoda stands at the center and can also be read as a symbol of the Qing state's patronage of Tibetan Buddhism, specifically reflecting the course high exaltation of the Gelu Pai, or the Yellow Height sect. In front of the gate stands a beautifully carved pile of kneeling stone elephants. In Buddhist symbolism, the elephant represents endurance and steadfast strength, reflecting the immense hardship and discipline involved in the spiritual practice of the Buddha and the monastic community. Behind the 5 Pagoda Gate stands a glazed ceremonial archway, a classic example of Han Chinese architecture commonly seen in Beijing. This archway served as a clear boundary marker. Beyond it began the residential quarters of the Lamas, as well as the temple's inner religious space. More importantly, access beyond this point was strictly controlled. Only the emperor, high-ranking court officials, and senior Mongol princes were allowed to enter the secret prince cage behind the archway. Once we pass the glazed archway, we begin the long ascent toward the highest part, the Great Red Terrace and the Great White Terrace. Scattered along the road to the summit are a number of smaller courtyards, known in Chinese as the East Gang Hall, the Middle Gang Hall, and the West Gang Hall. These buildings were mainly used by lower-ranking lamas for chanting scriptures. They also housed a large number of Tibetan Buddhist images. Unlike the strictly monotheistic traditions of the Abrahamic religions, Tibetan Buddhism developed through layers of adaptation. As Buddhism spread from India into Tibet during the 7th and 8th centuries, and continued to evolve on the Tibetan plateau, it absorbed many elements from the indigenous Bon tradition. Tibetan Buddhism came to include a vast and highly elaborate pantheon of deities. Their number runs into the hundreds, and even today there is no universally fixed total. We have now arrived beneath the magnificent main body, the Great White Terrace and the Great Red Terrace, built against the mountainside entirely from just granite blocks. The Great White Terrace forms the massive and stable foundation for the tower-like complex of the Great Red Terrace above. This type of elevated stone base reflects the architectural tradition of the Tibetan plateau. As for this kind of great fortress-like structure, with its walls narrowing upward as they rise, its origins can be traced back to the 7th and 8th centuries, roughly the same period when Indian Buddhism was entering Tibet. During the Second World War, the entire Chengde region was occupied by Japanese forces. The Japanese helicopters scratched onto the Great White Terrace. This crude graffiti was left behind by those soldiers who carved their own names into the stone. May the future of human society be free from war in every form. The stairway leading from the Great Wide Terrace up to the Great Red Terrace consists of exactly 104 steps. In Buddhism, human suffering is often said to take the form of 108 afflictions. The four most difficult to escape are birth, aging, illness, and death. The choice of 104 steps was meant to symbolize the hope that worshippers might leave behind the other 104 troubles of the human world and attain a kind of spiritual release while still alive. Beside this stairway, there is a small courtyard known as the Milk Courtyard. This was not a place for the disabled. Instead, when the emperor arrived, lower and middle-ranking lamas were not permitted to accompany him up to the Great Red Terrace for worship. They had to withdraw into this courtyard and remain out of sight, so as not to offend the imperial presence. So even here, in a secret Buddhist space meant to symbolize liberation from worldly suffering, the inequalities of human society were still firmly on display. We have now reached the very foot of the Great Red Terrace. In his journals, Lord Macartney spoke highly of the building's exterior, noting its resemblance to the royal palaces of Europe. The entire structure rises to a height of 43 meters, but for more than 30 of those meters, it is essentially a solid mass, a massive and immovable platform. Only the upper section contains full interior space. From below the Great Red Terrace, we can already look out toward the walls of the Chengde mountain resort. Beneath those walls, the hills are now covered in dense greenery, thick with trees and vegetation. According to local people, it was not like this until quite recently. After all, this is already far northern China, but in recent years, with heavier rainfall and rising temperatures, the area around the mountain resort has begun to take on a lush appearance more reminiscent of southern China. That may be another visible sign of global warming. One of Qianlong's major reasons for building Putuo Zongsheng Temple was not simply to receive the Dalai Lama or to provide a place for Mongol princes to worship. There was also a more personal motive to celebrate his own 60th birthday and his mother's 80th birthday in 1771. For an Eastern monarch as strong-willed and self-assured as the Qianlong Emperor, celebrating his and his mother's longevity may well have mattered even more than winning over the Mongol nobility. That is why on the southern wall of the Great Red Terrace, 6 images of Amita youth, the Buddha of infinite life, were carved into the surface. They symbolized Qianlong's 60th birthday. Shortly after the Qianlong Emperor had celebrated his 60th birthday, this grand complex provoked his fury. Because of poor construction management and possibly corruption as well, parts of the Great Red Terrace actually collapsed after a heavy rainstorm. Even the sections that remained standing suffered from serious leaks. Qianlong ordered the officials responsible for the project to repay the imperial losses out of their own salaries. From 1771 to 1775, the Qing court spent 400,000 taels of silver to restore the Great Red Terrace to its original condition, a sum roughly equivalent to about $300 million in purchasing power today. On the eastern side of the highest section of the complex, there is an open courtyard. At its center stands a Tibetan Opera stage. In the past, when the Qianlong Emperor accompanied his mother, Empress Dowager Chongqing, Here for worship, grand Tibetan opera performances were staged in this very space. In Chengde Mountain Resort, the Imperial family watched Peking Opera, a form that had spread from southern China and developed in the capital. But here in the temple, what they watched was Tibetan opera. In these small details of imperial life, the many-sided vitality of a multi-ethnic empire revealed itself. At the heart of the Great Red Terrace complex stands the magnificent Hall of Wanfaguiyi, the Hall of the Unity of all Dharma. In Chinese, Wanfaguiyi means that all Buddhist teachings ultimately return to one. At the same time, it also symbolized an East Asian political order brought under the unifying authority of the Qing Empire. This was the setting for major religious assemblies. In the past, the Zhouzhen Danba Hutu Ketu from Outer Mongolia and the Zhangjia Hutu Ketu from Inner Mongolia were invited to preach here, while the Qianlong Emperor listened beside them in the role of a protector of the faith and a Buddhist universal ruler. In 1771, nearly 1,000 Mongolian and Tibetan clerics and aristocrats gathered in and around the hall to offer birthday congratulations to the Qianlong Emperor on his 60th birthday and to his mother, Empress Dowager Chongqing, on her 80th. Inside the hall, the gilded dragon castle ceiling is extraordinarily elaborate, comparable in splendor to the finest interiors of the Forbidden City and the great Imperial temples of Beijing. Historical accounts also describe richly decorated tankas inside the hall, along with ceremonial seats associated with the Dalai Lama. But because of heritage protection, photography is strictly forbidden inside the hall. The roof of the hall is covered with 2 layers of face-scale gilded tiles. These tiles were coated with gold on the outside and made of brass underneath, giving the entire hall an exceptionally brilliant and majestic appearance. This is one of the main reasons why the Hall of Wanfaguiyi became the most magnificent single structure among all of Chengde's temples. These roof tiles consumed around 0.56 tons of gold. The gold was donated to the emperor by such merchants from Jiangsu province in the empire's wealthy south. During the Second World War, when Chengde was under Japanese occupation, some Japanese soldiers set their eyes on these gold-coated tiles and tried to scrape the gilding off with knives. But after climbing onto the roof ridge, 2 of 3 of them reportedly fell to their deaths. Shocked by what had happened, the soldiers took it as a sign of Buddhist divine power and abandoned the attempt. The scratched and damaged tiles we see today, with the brass showing through beneath the surface, are said to be the result of what those soldiers did. Not far from the Hall of Wanfaguiyi stands another pavilion-like structure known as the Hall of Weighing the 3 Realms. In Buddhist thought, the 3 realms usually refer to the realm of desire, the realm of form, and the formless realm. Inside the hall is a gilded bronze statue of Buddha Lama, about 116 centimeters tall, standing on a mule. Buddha Lama is regarded as a protective deity of the Dalai Lama. Legend says that this deity can traverse the 3 realms, discern good from evil, and subdue all evil obstacles. If Putuo Zongsheng Temple was conceived as a sacred space associated with the Dalai Lama, and if the Dalai Lama was revered as an incarnation of Avalokitesvara, then the Hall of Cihangpudu, dedicated to Avalokitesvara, represents the highest point of the entire temple complex. Cihangpudu means the compassionate salvation of all beings by Bodhisattva of mercy. Together, the Hall of Cihangpudu, the Hall of Wanfaguiyi, and the Hall of Weiying, the three realms, all crowned with gilded roofs, form a sacred architectural world centered on Avalokitesvara. At the same time, they also symbolized the political will of the Qianlong Emperor and the Qing Empire to use Tibetan Buddhism as a means of integrating and stabilizing Tibet and Inner Asia. And this is the full story of Putuo Zongsheng Temple. As a part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it warmly welcomes fans from all over the world. See you next time!